Welcome to Conscious Conversations, a place where East meets West, a place where conversations and ideas will challenge your minds, expand your consciousness, awaken your heart, and make you think more deeply about yourself and the world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conscious Conversations. I'm Anthony Profeta, and I'm here with fellow co-host Wes Gordon. How are you doing today, Wes?
Wonderful. Glad to be here.
Have a good week?
Absolutely. It's going to be a good day.
Good. Is that answer coming from your ego or from your true self?
Both. Both. Can we do both?
Well, I think at times that happens. But before we do get into today's topic, I do want to say you've been posting some very powerful and profound things on our Conscious Conversations Facebook community page. And so what's inspired that?
Actually, going into the silence.
Love it.
The thing I talk about, yeah.
Cool. Well, they've been great. And if any of you aren't part of the Conscious Conversations Facebook community, you can just go to Facebook and type in Conscious Conversations with Wes and Anthony, and you'll find the community and then join. And we'd love for you to be part of the community and engage with us there. Let us know your ideas and thoughts on the topics we're discussing, as well as, any thoughts you have on maybe topics that you'd like us to talk about in the future. But today, we thought we'd continue on with something we were touching upon last week in regards to this I inside of us. And we mentioned the ego. And I got a couple of messages afterwards from people who were saying that they liked the idea that we actually touched upon a healthy ego, because they've heard that an ego is good. And it's not something that is, we need to destroy or diminish. However, I wanted to just touch a little bit upon where this idea of a healthy ego really comes from, because it was you, Wes, that brought up the idea about a healthy ego.
Yes.
And I mentioned Freud, so I ran back after that episode and began to look through my Freud books and really dive into what his whole idea of the ego was, because I mentioned the id, the ego, and the superego. Yes. So according to Freud, now, he had this idea or this theory of the psychoanalytic theory of personality. And according to Freud, human personality is a complex mixture of three elements. The three elements are the id, the ego, and the superego. And these three elements emerge at different times in our life. So they arise at different times as according to our age or as our personality and concepts sort of develop. But the id itself is primal urges. It is completely unconscious, according to Freud, and it's really the pleasure urges that are sending us off into motion to, the urge of hunger, sexual desire. All of these sort of things are the motivations of the id. And it's, again, primal, and it seeks instant gratification of these urges and these wants and needs. Okay. Now, it is from here that Freud says the ego develops from. So the ego develops from the id, in the sense of the id's the primal motivating factor that chase all of these urges and pleasure seeking. But to Freud, the ego comes in as a good sort of thing, because what the ego does, according to the Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality, is that it directs the id and makes you think about the cause and effect, or the cause and the consequence of going after these primal urges. Because if we just gave in to every urge and pleasurable desire that arises from the id, it would really be maybe lead to unacceptable behavior at times.
Right.
So Freud says that the ego comes in and directs where we decide or where we choose to act and not act. And he famously described the id and the ego as a horse and a rider. So that the id was a horse. So it motivates us. It just drives after these primal urges. But the ego, which is the rider on the horse, gives guidance to steer that horse on where it would be better or wiser to go to. So that now leads to a third level of personality, which Freud called the superego. And last time you mentioned, well, does that fall into like the higher consciousness and the ideal self? And I wasn't too positive at that, so that's why I went back and started researching and looking again. And the superego, he said, is the ego that, or it steers the ego towards moral choices. So what society would say morally would be the right way to live and act and to strive for. So it's guiding us more morally towards things. So the ego in, one way would be how it drives us would be, not eating the whole chocolate cake and maybe just having one piece, where the id wants to devour all of it.
And the super id would be the 10 Commandments of the soul.
Yes, and how it's overlooking. So it's called super because it's guiding the ego to more moralistic and proper ways to actually live. So that is why in Western society and even American culture, many people have this idea that, well, an ego is a good thing. Because according to Freud and psychology, it is. Even Jung, who Freud was his mentor at one time, but he fell away and parted with Freud for the same concept that I brought up last time, that Freud was too obsessed with the sexual urges of, desire and the Oedipus complex and all of that. But even Jung said in his version of personality that the ego was a good thing. It's commander-in-chief. It's the part of the mind that is focused on reality, and it thinks about it and conceptualizes it and helps us to understand it in a certain way and in a better way. So for both of them, and from a psychological perspective, the ego is healthy.
Right.
But
psychologically perspective.
Right. Yes. That's the key word. So all of you out there who have this idea, well, isn't ego healthy? If we're talking about it simply from a psychological point of view and a psychological perspective, or if you're understanding it from Freud and Jung and those sort of theories,
constructs,
then healthy ego is a good thing. You want the ego because it's driving you away from your primal urges to just go after every pleasurable instinct.
So what ego are we talking about?
Now, we're striving and we're defining ego in a much different way. We're talking about it from a spiritual perspective, which is very different than the psychological idea of the ego. And we will get into why now, from spiritual perspective, we don't want the ego. We want it to be diminished, and we want it to maybe even be eliminated in a way. So what's your understanding from your spiritual path in terms of the, mysticism of the Christian faith or the Western faith in terms of the ego?
Well, for me, it evolved over time as far as how the understanding and meaning of it, our nature, our base nature, was actually what Paul and them were talking about in the New Testament, your carnal nature, the old man, the creature, like the basic part of you that tries to keep you in fear and alone and not serving or accessing your higher self. And that's the flesh warring against the spirit, is how they termed it in the Bible.
Yes, that inner struggle. And that's falls in line with the whole Eastern philosophy. From the Eastern perspective, the ego refers to our identification with really our personal experience of the world. So it's the ego from the Hindu and Buddhist tradition says that there's me and then there's everything else. And due to the me that we perceive, even though they would say it's an illusionary me, or I, because to throw out some Latin to you again, ego, that word is Latin, and it means I. So from the Eastern perspective, the I of the ego is illusionary. There's not a separation between myself and everything in the world. There's an interdependence and an interconnection between all things and all life. But from the Eastern perspective, the idea that there's a me now causes that to see a separation between itself and everything else. And for that reason, selfishness arises. And so now the me or the I, the ego, needs to think about, well, me, or I, me, mine. And, there's not enough in the world, so I better make sure that I have everything because otherwise there's lack and other people will get it before I do. So selfishness arises from that. And that's why, to the Eastern perspective, we want to diminish the selfish nature.
Right.
But I think we need to pause here for a break, and we'll come back and we'll continue to discuss this whole idea of the ego from the spiritual perspective. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to Conscious Conversations. I'm Anthony Profeta, and I'm having a conversation with co-host Wes Gordon on the ego. And we were mentioning about how it came from the psychological perspective and Freud and all of that, how it could be considered good in some ways. But now we're diving into the spiritual component.
Right.
And why most spiritual traditions say that it's not good to have an ego. We want to diminish it, or if not, actually eliminate it altogether. And we just touched upon the idea that from Eastern traditions, the ego arises from our identification with the perceived separation between us and everything else. And due to that perceived separation, selfishness begins to arise because we think it becomes all about me.
Right.
And I need to get everything for me. And, the ego sort of focuses on the physical a lot. So it tries to control everything in the world around us. And it also tries to, acquire for you all these possessions and like the perfect house and the perfect car and the perfect partner and all of these sort of things. And I mean, what is the perfect house? And according to the ego, once you get that house that was perfect for you in the beginning, the house with the white picket fence, the dog in the yard, and
yes,
beautiful everything to it, that house eventually becomes at some points dissatisfying. And then you're out chasing for a better, more perfect house.
Right.
And so that's why I believe Jesus said, store up your possessions in heaven. He's not talking about the egoic possessions that the ego searches for, the things of the physical world. He's saying to store up the things that is beyond the ego. Store up your love, store up your mercy, your forgiveness, the patience, all of those qualities that, as he said, moth and rust do not destroy.
Right.
And that's why it's needed to diminish one and begin to increase the other. And so from the Eastern perspective, the reason why you want to diminish it is because it's tied to selfishness, which is the cause of a lot of misery and suffering in the world. But doing that is sort of tricky, isn't it?
Very tricky. 'Cause you're in what we call the third dimension or the 3D world, and it's all based on physicality.
Right.
So that's the home of the ego, the home of duality. And that's a tricky thing to start to realize that the real power is in the invisible.
Yes.
That makes no sense to the mind. It's like you've lost it. But actually everything in this room and everything you've ever seen or has been created initially come from the invisible to start with. Spirit is way more than the limited duality of, life and death.
Yes.
And that's where the ego is stuck and lives at. That there's got to be a good, there's got to be a bad.
Yeah.
Transcend up to a different level to see a larger picture.
So from your perspective, do you believe that the ego needs to be diminished or eliminated, or how do you work with that from your point of view?
I think that's what the scriptures were talking about when he said you need to learn how to die daily.
Okay.
And it was the attachment part that your religions or your practices talk about. It's not being attached to all those physical things. Use them, but don't be indebted to them. Understand their place.
Right.
Just like money. They say love of money is the root of all evil, but it's actually, money's not evil in itself.
Yes. And I love that you said just now, everything has its place or, used in its place, because I was listening to actually a Jewish rabbi. And from his perspective, he said that the ego is not to be destroyed because it is part of creation. And everything of creation is, in essence, useful or purposeful. But he did say, however, that the ego must realize it is a creation and therefore serve the purpose of what it was used for and not rule us. So even though he said it's not to be destroyed, he did say it needs to be diminished and become, I guess, in a way, subservient to the higher aspect of us or our higher self.
Right.
The thing is, from many Eastern traditions' point of views, it becomes a slippery slope.
Big time.
Because the ego, I think we used this analogy last time, is like that game Whack-A-Mole, where it will pop up its head anywhere it can.
Yes.
So you think you're becoming more spiritual and you're doing all of these sort of things, but really what's happening is spiritual pride and egoic pride, and things start now manifesting in your spiritual practices.
Yeah. And you actually have a spiritual ego, which is a concept in itself. You know, some people say that's impossible. You can't have a spiritual ego. But I disagree in the fact that it's actually a concept and people actually exhibit it. I've seen some mighty, righteous, self-righteous people with huge spiritual egos thinking they're immune to it. And they're actually feeding into it and not even realizing it.
Right. They're unaware of actually what's happening. In Eastern traditions, they believe that, you know, what can happen is as you begin to practice, as you begin to set your foot and truly walk your spiritual path with awareness and purpose, there might come a time where you notice that you now begin to look at other people who aren't on the spiritual path or aren't practicing what you're practicing or trying to better themselves in some way as you being superior to them.
And you're not.
And you're not. And this happens a lot of times I've seen with certain areas and certain groups. And I'm not speaking or calling out anyone in particularly, but I have seen people who maybe are vegetarians or vegans, and they think, well, my way of living is better because I'm bringing less harm to the world. And I do understand that. I agree with that, that you are participating in bringing less harm into your life. But to say that your way is better than someone else's who does eat meat is actually not a spiritual outlook to have, because to say everyone should be a vegetarian would be like saying everyone should be Christian or everyone should be Buddhist or everyone should be any particular religion. Just as, you know, it's a good thing to have multiple religions, because if there was one religion, it wouldn't satisfy all 7 billion minds out there. Everybody needs different paths and different rituals and practices to do. But it's the same thing with our diet.
Yeah.
Not everybody and not every person falls into, for them, having a vegetarian diet would sustain them. And there are people that it's needed. In fact, the Dalai Lama, there was a point in time where his doctor told him he needed to incorporate more chicken into his diet.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, that's necessary at times. So I have seen where spiritual pride does raise its head in certain things, but I've seen it in myself also, that when I first began practicing meditation and somebody would say to me, oh yeah, I'm just starting, I'm meditating now for 5 to 10 minutes a day. A little voice in the back of my mind might go up and say, yeah, well, I meditate for an hour morning and night.
That's where that judge not lest you be judged. And also, everybody's at different levels of consciousness and awareness, too.
Right.
That's why I always say there's a lot of roads that lead to the same place. There's many paths.
Yes.
The thing is that I see, though, the danger that I perceive is people being stuck or attached to a specific path and not allowing to be more expansive.
Yeah. Like,
that's the only way.
Right.
That's where you've become stuck.
Closed-minded.
Yes.
Yes. And I believe, from my opinion and perspective, I believe all paths are valid. They're all leading up the same mountain. But something I find interesting in terms of Tibetan Buddhism, they have a distinction between two things, spiritual pride and divine pride. And they say that divine pride is something you actually want to have.
Really?
That's the ability to recognize that you are a child of God, that you have an essence of the Buddha nature within yourself, and that is your divine birthright. And there's nothing wrong with stating that, believing that, and wanting to become that to its fullest potential. But spiritual pride is different than divine pride. Spiritual pride is thinking that, well, my way is better than your way, or I'm better than you because of some practices or path that I am walking.
Right.
So
also realize too that ego energy, that ego consciousness is all based on temporal. It's death.
Yes.
It's not everlasting. It fades in the moment. It's like a drug. That's why you always need more. You need more stuff, more action, more experiences, whereas the spiritual is eternal.
Yep. And,
huge difference.
And like the ego we were saying before, is focused really on the physical. Yes. And this world. And this world is impermanent, and everything here is impermanent. Also, the ego thinks in terms of me, and the true higher self thinks in terms of we.
Yes.
Which is a very important distinction to bring up as well.
That show we're going to have.
Yes, which is leading us, for those of you that are watching and listening, this is leading us to a discussion that it will be coming up the week of Halloween, which you will not want to miss.
Absolutely. Don't miss this show.
It's going to be very fun, very entertaining, maybe a little controversial, but
yes,
we'll see where that goes. But I'd just like to basically close, because we're basically at our last minutes here. We're just saying that through psychology, an ego can be healthy. Through spirituality, an ego selfishness is something we want to overcome and something we want to diminish or decrease. And I'll just leave you with this quote by the Buddha, who said, "He who overcomes himself is greater than he who overcomes 1,000 armies."
Wow.
And when he's talking about that, he's talking about the selfish nature, the one that just thinks in terms of I, me, mine.
A true master.
Yes. And so we've run out of time today, but we thank you all for listening. We love all of you. If you're not part of the Conscious Conversations community, please join us on Facebook. And we encourage you, please let us know, what do you think, either good or bad? Did you like what we talked about? Did you not like what we talked about? Did you have other opinions in terms of this? You can also catch us on Sunday on Real Radio 101.7 and also on Spotify. If you've missed this live stream, you can catch us there as well. We thank you all. We love you all. And we hope that each and every one of your days is filled with an abundance of love, happiness, and peace.